Sounds good. All right. Thank y'all so much for having me. I'm so grateful to be here. And having listened to the other talks, I appreciate that we can build on that. And so I'm going to talk a little bit from an NIH perspective on things that we're doing. If you're interested, you can follow at NIGMS Training. Just to give a little outline, I'll start with definitions and a little bit of data. We're scientists, data is important. Data are important. NIGMS programmatic activities and approaches across the training pathway. A few trans NIH initiatives which you might not be aware of. Some have been recently launched. And then finally, I'll riff for a few minutes on my own personal take on advancing racial equity, really the importance of listening, acknowledging, and more than anything, acting. So first, definitions and data. Again, there are lots of things that we use, but diversity. So diversity talks about numerical representation in the biomedical sciences, right? And so as I say frequently, I'm a Black man, not a diverse individual. And diversity is a property of groups, right? Not individuals. In thinking about diversity, we often talk about underrepresentation. And so we talk about groups that, despite being well represented and well reflected in the population, aren't well reflected in biomedical sciences. We then talk about inclusion and belonging, which is your felt experience within the biomedical enterprise. And then finally, equity and justice, really. So how are you treated? What access do you have to opportunities and resources? And then what are the outcomes as it relates to anything from admission to graduate school to tenure and getting an NIH grant, for example? So these are some data that have come from the National Science Foundation. You can view an earlier version of this in a Life Sciences Education publication from Drs. Hannah Valentine, Kay Lund, and Allison Gammy in 2016. What this shows is across the training pathway how representation changes. And so in orange, we have women. In green, we have men. The darker colored are men and women from well-represented or white or Asian backgrounds, which does not mean that people don't experience discrimination. Particularly in the week after the Atlanta murders, we think about anti-Asian racism and discrimination in America and in science. At the same time, there's a good mathematical representation. And so those groups we term as well represented. Then other groups we term as underrepresented. And so that can be Hispanic or Latina or X communities, African American or Black, Native American, Alaska Native, and Pacific Islander. As you go from the associates to full professor, you see that the dark green bar gets bigger and all the other bars get smaller. But importantly, you know, in the life sciences, the majority of bachelor's degrees go to women and the majority of PhDs go to women. And we have a significant number of students from underrepresented groups at the bachelor's level, up to 17%, which is not at population level, but much better than it was previously. Again, as we go down, and particularly once we hit to the professoriate, even though, you know, roughly 60% of the PhD pool are white or Asian women or men and women from underrepresented groups, they become right about 40% of the assistant professor pool. So even from PhD to through postdoc to faculty positions, we're seeing differences in representation. So this frames some of the work, how we think about the work that we're doing. We support early, as well as thinking about how can we support scholars through transitions into independence and beyond. And so now I'll talk a little bit about NIGMS programmatic activities. If you're not familiar, NIGMS, we are the basic science institute of NIH. And so we don't focus on, you know, a body part, life stage, or disease, but really thinking about basic principles and including Drosophila genetics, which is a great to talk here. So we also take an emphasis on building research capacity and research training and workforce diversity across NIH. And so collectively, we administer over about 1,000 research training and diversity enhancing awards at more than 300 institutions at the clip of about $340 million per year. On the next slide, I'll show you what that breaks down to. And so you can look at this on our website, but this breaks down to a suite of programs starting from the community college stage up and through the faculty level. I'm not going to go through each of them, but again, we have strong support across the training pathways and particularly focusing on how do we help people navigate and bridge through transitions. And so recently in the last few years, we've reconceptualized our programs. We used to have maybe think of them as general training and then diversity enhancing programs. And what we're really thinking now is that all of our programs, whether they have a diversity enhancing focus or not, really play a role in enhancing diversity and important equity and inclusion throughout the enterprise. And so all of our programs are expected to focus on providing students of cross backgrounds with the technical, like methods and technology, operational, acquiring information, experimental data design, experimental design, that is, and data interpretation, and professional skills like management, leadership, communication, teamwork, particularly working with diverse teams, that are important for careers in the biomedical research workforce. We expand on that through these bullet points, which I don't expect you to read all now, but if you ever apply to our funding announcements, you will see some version of these. I've highlighted, though, a couple of points that are relevant to the talk of this plenary session. And so all programs, whether it's an undergrad program to promote students going to the PhD, or a graduate training program in genetics, are expected to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion throughout the research training environment. That includes with the students, postdocs, and faculty. They are asked to do this, and they are evaluated on this by peer review panels. They're encouraged to promote inclusive, safe, and supportive research environments that's built on some of what Dr. Street was talking about as it relates to the community and making sure that people feel safe to express themselves and be themselves, as well as thinking about physical lab safety. We also want them to employ cohort building activities because, again, as Dr. Street and others have mentioned, there can be this isolation that can happen. And so we want our programs to build cohorts, and we know that this is important for all students, and we have lots of evidence that it's particularly important for those from historically underrepresented groups, and that importantly, maybe the cohort activities that happen for students from well-represented groups need to be intentionally redesigned and recreated for those from underrepresented groups. Also, all of our applications include recruitment plans to enhance diversity, focusing, for example, on those from underrepresented racial and ethnic groups, students with disabilities, students from low socioeconomic disadvantaged backgrounds. A retention plan that really thinks about how do we make sure that the environment is going to be one that is supportive to trainees from all backgrounds. And a mentor training, assessment, and accountability plan, because we know that mentors are incredibly important, and that oversight of mentors is incredibly important because some are great for students of any background, some are not great. And so if they're in the context where the mentors are being more like tour mentors, there needs to be a plan and steps to remove those folks so that they're not harming the next generation of scientific contributors. The next slide, I'll talk about a few examples of those in the undergrad and predoctoral space. Again, I encourage you to look at our website to look at all of the programs that we have available. But how this operationalizes is, for example, in terms of building community mentoring, skills development, and promoting transitions, I'll point to these programs. So we have URISE, MARC, GRISE, and IMSD. So these programs have similar goals at both the undergrad and graduate stages. They're just targeted at different institution types. And so URISE and GRISE are targeted at what we call research active institutions, which have research activity, but not the highest level of research activity. And then MARC and IMSD are targeted at research intensive universities. So they have more than $7.5 million per year of NIH research project grant funding. And all these programs, again, they support trainees for 1 to 2 years at the grad stage and 2 to 3 years at the undergrad stage. And they provide tuition remission and stipend, because we know that financial support is very important for students as they are going through their training, and it allows them to actually focus on their research training. Research experiences, including summer research experiences for undergraduates, seminars, networking, career and development activities. Again, cohort building activities to enhance things like science identity. Do I think of myself as a scientist? Your efficacy, how confident am I in my ability to progress through the various pathways that we'll have, as well as individualized mentoring and oversight throughout the training stage. We also have a program called PrEP, which is our post-baccalaureate research education program, which provides 1-year post-baccalaureate research apprenticeships and skills development programs for scholars for emerging and budding scientists from historically underrepresented groups and other diverse backgrounds. As they finish their baccalaureate, they know they want to do a PhD, but they desire some additional research skill and time to prepare as they go forward. So it's a 1-year apprenticeship program. And importantly, when we evaluated this program, 75% of the participants progress on to and to have success in their PhD programs. So these are just a few examples of programs at the institutional level that we support. And I would encourage you, if you're interested, to go to our website, NIGMS TWD, Make sure you do NIGMS before you do TWD, because it's a television show that has TWD as its acronym. And so make sure you go to NIGMS TWD and look at the programs and reach out to me or my colleagues as appropriate about which of the programs might be good for your institution. And so we know that building the pathway early is important and building the talent pool early is important, but we know that that's not enough. And so we're focusing additionally on enhancing faculty diversity. This is a little bit more data that I'll share, and this is from a paper that I published with some colleagues back in eLife a few years back. And so in the gray line, you see the number of PhD graduates from historically underrepresented racial and ethnic groups: Black, Latin, Latino X, and Hispanic, as well as American Indian, Alaska Native, and Pacific Islander. And in the black line, you see the number of assistant professors in basic science departments at AAMC medical schools. So what you can see, one, with the gray line is that we have essentially an exponential growth in the population of PhD graduates from historically underrepresented groups. When many of these programs started back in the 70s, the population was truly very small of those who were participating in science training. And so rightly, we focused on building that pool, and through the work of institutions and the work of NIH and others, we've been able to build a strong pool of underrepresented PhD scientists. Where we haven't seen the same transitions at the faculty level, right? Where you go from 130 in 1980 to 340 in the mid 2000s. If you normalize this, you see that there's, again, a 9-fold increase in PhDs, but a fewer than 3-fold increase in underrepresented people moving to assistant professor levels. And if you look really deep in the data from the years 2005 to 2014, there were actually fewer. There were 6 fewer, I think 8 fewer underrepresented assistant professors, even though there were nearly 7,000 PhDs who had graduated in the preceding decade. So one way the NIH and with NIGMS leadership is aiming to address this gap is through our program called Mosaic. So Mosaic stands for Maximizing Opportunities for Scientific and Academic Independent Careers. And it's designed to facilitate the transition of promising postdoctoral researchers from diverse backgrounds, for example, those underrepresented at the faculty level, into independent faculty careers at research-intensive institutions. And the overarching goal of the Mosaic program is to enhance the diversity of independent investigators conducting research within the NIH mission. We know that, for example, K-99 programs can be effective, but we know that they have been defective to date at attracting and effectively evaluating a diverse pool of scholars. And so the goal of this program is to attract and better evaluate a more diverse pool of scholars who can then go on to contribute their research relevant to the NIH mission. And so this works a couple ways. One, from the perspective of postdocs, and if you have postdocs in your lab, particularly those from underrepresented groups, encourage them to apply. They apply. It's a K-99 competition like any other. The review criteria specifically on the research are identical, although there are some additional review criteria because we know that many scholars from underrepresented groups are taking on additional service work by virtue of existing. And so we want to actually acknowledge those contributions as part and parcel of their scientific contribution. But they compete 3 times a year. And then they are, after they compete and successfully get their K-99 award, we then assign them to companion awards through scientific societies. The 3 that we've funded to date are the American Society for Biochemistry and Molecular Biology, the American Society for Cell Biology, and the Association of American Medical Colleges. And the goal here is to be, again, we know that cohorts are important, so to be a part of a cohort with like-minded scholars from similar backgrounds where you get additional mentoring and networking, career visibility enhancement. And importantly, these institutions are these scientific society partners, which are called UE5, that's just a technical name for the grant mechanism, work with the institutions where the scholars have their awards, for example, their postdoc mentors or department chairs at the R00 stage, to make sure that the scholars are getting the support that they need. And so Mosaic K-99 applications are accepted 3 times per year. The next due date is June 12th. And so again, I encourage you all to apply. I'm the program contact at NIGMS. But importantly, this is now a trans-NIH opportunity, and nearly every IC that participates in the parent also is participating in Mosaic. And so you can see those listed here. And if you're in a mission area that's not necessarily reflected here, just reach out and we can think about what options might exist. And if you're a faculty member thinking about recruiting your next generation of scholars, I encourage you to go to the Mosaic webpage. Again, if you Google NIGMS and Mosaic, it'll come up. You can look at the scholars webpage, but we have seen a robust interest from the community, demonstrating the idea that there are, in fact, a lot of scholars from a wide variety of backgrounds, especially those that are underrepresented, who are participating and contributing to science at a high level, contributing to enhancing diversity, and they're ready and poised to take their roles in the next generation of scientific leaders. And so this is the first group. The next 5 will be announced next week, I believe. Robust women, many women of color. And so again, keep your eyes out and recruit them, and tell your colleagues and tell your postdocs to apply if interested. I'm going to turn now to a few trans NIH initiatives that you may be aware of and just want to highlight because they will be of interest now and in the years coming. The first is actually called FIRST. So FIRST stands for Faculty Institutional Recruitment for Sustainable Transformation. And it's a common fund program that aims to enhance and maintain cultures of inclusive excellence in the biomedical research community. Again, their aim is to work with institutions to broaden culture and bring in cohorts of scholars that will advance this. And this is based on a program that has happened in the intramural research program called the Distinguished Scholars Program. Let's see. And so the NIH FIRST cohort is expected to fund 12 awards over the next 3 years. The first set will be announced in late 2021. And what I want to encourage postdocs to do, particularly those from underrepresented groups, to stay tuned and be aware of these future awardee institutions. The programs are going to be required to provide environments that promote inclusive excellence. And they have a faculty development core where there's mentorship, a retention plan, protected time, and other aspects that are going to be particularly important for persistence in academic careers. I next want to point to a new initiative called Unite. And so this is as Dr. Street mentioned, after the events of last summer and the murder of George Floyd, NIH, like many organizations, did some introspection about where we are, what progress we've made, and where we're failing. And so part of this initiative is really to tackle head-on structural racism in the biomedical community. And it's made up of 5 different committees of NIH staff. So one focuses on understanding stakeholder experiences through listening and learning. New research on health disparities, minority health, and health equity. Improving the NIH culture and structure for equity, inclusion, and excellence, really thinking about the NIH workforce, both the intramural research program as well as those of us in extramural positions, and who is there, what access do you have to leadership, information, et cetera. Promoting transparency, communication, and accountability for internal and external stakeholders. And then the extramural research ecosystem. So how do we change policy, culture, and structure to promote workforce diversity? Importantly, there's a request for information out right now. And so this, if you are interested in this, I encourage you to Google or use your favorite search engine to look at the NIH Unite initiative. There's an area where you're asked questions, you can put in your feedback. It is being listened to at the highest levels. And I have noticed new attention to advancing the cause of racial equity at the NIH in the past, in the past few months, in addition to our diversity work that we've been doing for long standing. As a follow-on to Unite, I'll talk about 2 opportunities that are interested, funding opportunities of interest. So one is a notice of special interest. And so this is how NIH or an institute says, this is a topic area that we're particularly interested in. And so NIGMS, we put out one in the past few weeks on really understanding and addressing the impact of structural racism and discrimination on biomedical career progression and the biomedical research enterprise, with the idea being help us to have actionable evidence that we can use to really begin to dismantle some of these structures that are in place. And so you can look at that. We fund that through a number of different mechanisms. We also are participating in an NIH-wide initiative that is coming through the National Institutes for Minority Health and Health Disparities on understanding and addressing the impact of structural racism and discrimination on minority health and health disparities. So again, our interest at NIJMS specifically, that notice, is about biomedical career progression and biomedical research enterprise, but we're participating in this broader initiative as we think about minority health and health disparities. And that can be relative to our clinical areas like sepsis, that can be algorithmic bias because that's part of our mission, that can be on mechanistic studies that look at the effects of discrimination and discrimination-based social trauma on epigenetic and other molecular and cellular processes, right? Whether you are up on the literature on weathering or not, there's the idea that trauma is mediated both, cellularly, epigenetically, physiologically. And so this is a way, if you're interested, to please follow up on that. In the last few minutes, I'll share a few thoughts on promoting diversity and enhancing racial equity in the biomedical sciences. This is based on a piece I wrote last fall that was in the American Society for Cell Biology's newsletter. And so if you Google that or use your favorite search engine, you can find the piece there. But a couple of salient points that I wanted to add to this conversation are, one, just really thinking about what we're doing here, right? So the point of diversity isn't simply to have a lot of differently colored or gendered bodies coexisting in the lab, but really to ensure that everybody can show up and contribute as their full selves, right? And so without a culture of inclusion and equity, diversity really can represent another form of oppression and exclusion. Because if you have me there, but don't actually want the fullness of me, I identify as a Black man, I'm descended from enslaved ancestors who were enslaved here on the American shores, right? My family's been here for hundreds of years. And if you can't handle that, what that reflects in terms of how I just have to operate in the world, diversity isn't enough, right? And so when we promote diversity without an equal commitment to racial justice, we're really reinforcing the social hierarchies that have marred our society and marred our science for centuries. And that directly harms, us as scientists, particularly those from underrepresented groups and other minority groups, as well as it impairs our entire research ecosystem. Because when we don't feel like we can belong, then we'll often go to contribute elsewhere, and then the system is robbed of the contributions that we can make. But principally, I'm thinking about the harms to individuals. As we think about moving forward, it's like, this is really hard. Nobody does it right. Dr. Street made the point that no program is perfect. No institution is perfect. I'm not perfect, right? And so, but the ways that I've learned to move forward as a community, particularly if you have power, is to listen to those who live through and live with the impacts of the systemic and racial inequity, acknowledge where we are and how we got here, and then act to make it better, right? And so listening means taking the time to understand what's happening, right? We're researchers. We know how to do research. We know how to understand things, right? And we often say this is a hard problem, right? But we're scientists. We do hard things. We put people on the moon. I'm a stem cell biologist by training, and so we can, make a whole mouse out of induced pluripotent stem cells, to take a fibroblast and 4 factors. We can do lots of hard things. But really, it can be hard to listen because you're like, oh, and really to acknowledge what role you may have played in this, right? But listening means providing space to your colleagues and trainees to share if they choose to. Echoing the point made earlier, listening to social and behavioral scientists who really have robust frameworks for understanding and addressing these issues. Acknowledge where your organization is. Data are important, right? As I say, when I was in graduate school, there were more Black presidents of the United States than there were Black tenured faculty in basic science, because there was 1 Barack Obama and 0. And I don't say that to disparage my own institution, because basically every institution that I interviewed at had the same issue, and many parts of NIH have that issue in our intramural and extramural leadership. But we're scientists, we are committed to truth. And if we look at squarely where we are, the truth will and can set us free. And then finally, it's important to act. And so talk and internal feelings don't bring change. Resource allocation and policy do. Mosaic is an example of how at least NIJMS is beginning, but not ending to act in this space. And that can also include examples like holistic review for admissions and grant funding. And I think it's important when we act to act locally and specifically. And so sometimes we use this broad banner of diversity, but sometimes we basically say, like, we have white, heterosexual, able-bodied, middle-class men, and then everybody else. And that's not really a great way to think about it. It's really thinking about who do you have locally and what are they experiencing. But I remain confident that we can do this. We're scientists, we do hard things, but we can do this. And I think I'll close with saying, what do we need? And I'd say from my own experience and having interviewed and lived with hundreds, trained alongside, hundreds of scholars from underrepresented groups, we need opportunity, we need resources, and we need respect, right? And so if given the same things, we can have equitable outcomes. We often have less opportunity, we're given fewer resources and are experiencing less respect. And so what you see as a racial disparity is just the embodiment in the epitome of those deprivations ahead of time. So I'm out of time. I am happy to take questions now, as well as you can send me an email, and I encourage you to follow us at NIGMS Training. Thank you so much for having me here.